Good morning. Welcome, everyone, to our discussion today on a fascinating and timely new book, Innovate to Dominate, The Rise of the Chinese Techno-Security State by Professor Tai Ming CHEUNG. My name is Jia Wang. I'm the Interim Director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. I'm so pleased to welcome Professor CHEUNG to the China Institute virtually today. You can find a link to his book in our chat. The University of Alberta respectively acknowledges that we're situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. The techno-security domain, as Professor CHEUNG argues in his book, is where national security, innovation, and economic development converge, and it has become the center of power and prosperity in the 21st century. President Xi Jinping, China's most powerful leader since Mao, recognized that effectively harnessing the complex interactions among security, innovation, and development is essential in enabling China to compete for global dominance. As the world watched the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Congress concluded on Sunday, it has never been more evident that security, broadly defined, and technological innovation are front and center to President Xi's third term and China's national strategy for the next 5 years, and perhaps far beyond. We will open our today's event with a presentation by Professor CHEUNG, to be followed by a moderated discussion and Q&A. We encourage our audience members to submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now it's my honor to introduce our featured speaker. Dr. Tai Ming CHEUNG is a professor at the School of Global Policy and director of the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at the University of California, San Diego. His research focus includes China's efforts to become a world-class science and technology power and the relationship between geoeconomics, innovation, and national security. He is a long-term analyst and leading expert on China and East Asia defense and national security affairs, especially relates to economic, industrial, technology, and innovation issues. He was previously a correspondent at the Far Eastern Economic Review. Dr. CHEUNG has a PhD in war studies from King's College, London. Now, without further ado, I would like to turn the virtual floor over to Tai, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Jia. And it's a pleasure to talk to everyone at the China Institute, University of Alberta. I'm sorry to hear that it was 0 degrees today in temperature-wise, but hopefully my talk will help warm you up a little bit, but no promises. So I'm going to share my screen. So as the kind introduction by Professor Wang about sort of the book that I wrote itself, and sort of and what I'm going to do today is to provide sort of like an overview and sort of and a little bit of a dive into some of the key issues, and of course, given sort of what's been going on in China in the past week or two, I'll also sort of link in to what I see over the next 5 years in Xi Jinping's third term, as demonstrated by his keynote speech at the 20th Party Congress, how techno-security issues are going to be front and center of development priorities and development strategy itself. So I'll try to keep this not too long, because I know that sort of like sort of excessive screen time with PowerPoints leads to people's attentions drifting very, very quickly. So as Professor Wang has said, the techno-security domain is a term which I sort of put together, and sort of where national security, technological innovation, military power, sort of an economic development sort of converge and interact. It's a very sort of complex interactions. It's a very complex domain. But it's very important to understand this domain because it's the front and center of where sort of US-China great power competition is at its most cutting edge and it's at its most adversarial. And we see this sort of like in the 2022 US National Security Strategy that was issued last week that also said that sort of like pointed out that China is the only competitor to the US with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly sort of like to use its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do so. And the US strategy points out the next 10 years will be this decisive decade. And this is something that is very much evident in remarks by Chinese leaders itself. So what I would look at is this sort of like the building of this Chinese Techno-Security State under Xi Jinping and what this means for the US and China in terms of their rivalry and the race for global techno-security leadership. What I want to do begin is to provide sort of a historical context to anchor what we're seeing today compared with what is often referred to sort of like as the first Cold War compared to the new emerging second Cold War of the 21st century itself. And one way to look at this is when we looked at sort of like when the US was last engaged in great power rivalry in the second half of the 20th century, between the end of the Cold War and sort of the beginning to the mid 1990s, there was the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that was sort of the geostrategic, the military sort of great power competition between the US and the Soviet Union. But it's relevant to also look at sort of a second part to this, the geo-economic, the commercial, technological, not Cold War, but great power rivalry that the US had with Japan, also sort of beginning sort of in the 60s and 70s and rising on to much of the 1990s. And so when you look at sort of the US engaged between the Soviet Union and Japan, it's sort of like it's a very distinctive landscape. So you have on the left-hand side, on the defense sphere or the geostrategic sphere with the Soviet Union, you have Japan on the geo-economic, the commercial side on the right. And what you had was a very sharp sort of like divide. There sort of like there wasn't very little integration or interaction between the defense sphere and the commercial sphere, because the Soviet Union and Japan were very, very different. One was communist and sort of like engaged in an ideological and strategic Cold War with the US, and on the other side you have the Japan, which was sort of like very much part of sort of like the West. So there was this sort of very sort of like compartmentalized divide that meant that there was very little in terms of dual use interactions. There was sort of like all sorts of export control regimes that prevented this sort of move between the two. And what you had was that the US techno-security state during this first Cold War was competing against both the Soviet Union and Japan, but the US had a very integrated approach to its military, its economic, its strategic, its technological development. The US techno-security state, there was a significant amount of overlap in the middle of this dual-use military civil space that is able to compete both on the military side as well as the commercial side, and was able to leverage its innovation system, sort of like its firms that could do sort of both military and civilian and capabilities. And this integrated US techno-security state was a major reason why it performed so successfully and won both against the Soviet Union, sort of like and Japan itself. So the US had this integrated approach. compared to its adversaries at that time, or competitors at that time, which were sort of like in sort of one-dimensional in these spaces. And the competition that the US faces today is that the Chinese Techno-Security State is much more like the US in terms of the Chinese Techno-Security State is integrated both on the defense and the commercial side, that there's a growing, although there's still lots of problems in the dual-use military civil sphere within China. And this is a very important sort of priority for the Chinese to increase this integration between the defense and the geostrategic and the commercial and the geo-economic spheres. So the competition or the adversary that the US faces in the 21st century is very, very different from what it faced during the first Cold War. So while there's some similarities between the first Cold War, there's a lot more differences that shows that the US and China are sort of like more closely sort of like organized in their strategic competition. But while both the US and China today are integrated techno-security states, the way that they approach sort of technology development, military modernization, sort of like, and all the issues related in this techno-security state is organized very differently. And what I would point out, and I will talk about this towards the end of the presentation, is that the Chinese techno-security state is what we call a very statist sort of model of development. It's very top-down, it's very state-led, while the US is much more of an anti-statist techno-security state, where it's more of a bottom-up, sort of more of a market-driven, where the state, in the US case, is much more limited, much more constrained, compared to the Chinese state or the Chinese party state, where it's much more sort of like interventionist and much more sort of like sort of pervasive and all commanding. And understanding the status versus anti-status model is critical in terms of framing the nature of the competition and trying to determine who's going to win out over the long term. And we'll discuss this a little bit more. But before we do that, it's important to understand what is the makeup of the Chinese techno-security state. And the Chinese techno-security state that I'm looking at is the state that in particular Xi Jinping has forged in his first 2 terms in power since 2012. And what we'll see is in this 3rd term how that's going to evolve. But this is not the first Chinese techno-security state. This is the model 2.0 under Xi Jinping. I would argue that the first Chinese techno-security state was when Mao Zedong came to power, and this was sort of from the end of the 1940s right up until sort of like the mid-1970s, which was the Maoist techno-security state, the 1.0 model, where during this period between the 50s and the 70s, China was heavily militarized, was focused on developing sort of military capabilities to ensure its survival itself. But it's like during this early Maoist period, a lot of it was on industrialization, was on sort of very early stages of technological development, while under the Xi Jinping era, the focus is on not on necessarily on catching up, but much more on trying to become sort of like an increasingly advanced, increasingly sort of like sort of on the cutting edge techno-security state, looking to challenge for global leadership itself. So sort of like my definition of the Chinese techno-security state under Xi Jinping is that it's a security maximizing state that is building its power and prestige on a very capable economic and technological foundation. It's important to emphasize it's the notion of security maximization, which is sort of like the emphasis on sort of security as the top priority, as opposed to development maximizing, which was sort of like the rubric that the predecessors to Xi, sort of from Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, it was a development maximizing state itself. And so what this means is that as a security maximizing state, there's the Chinese Techno-Security State. Sort of like the priorities are to meet sort of expansive national security requirements, sort of like sort of more important than general economic interest itself. And also, it's like a security maximizing state. It tends to see the world very differently, more in zero-sum terms, as opposed to sort of win-win as development focused states are in. And also a techno-security state. What you see is that the power coalitions that are sort of like at the center of power, that are close to the leadership, tends to be from the security bureaucracy or the strategic and defense communities that are emphasizing technological innovation for strategic requirements as opposed to economic development needs itself. And over the past decade, under sort of this techno-security maximizing framework, the Xi Jinping administration has formulated a whole series sort of interlocking sort of strategies, guidance plans sort of that helps to shape the long-term development of the Chinese techno-security state. I mean, when Xi Jinping comes to power, he's not thinking in terms of his first term of building this techno-security state, but this is very much of a long-term, so next 1 to 2 to even 3 decades sort of strategic vision. And in the book, for many of these points, I sort of cover it in a chapter of sort of the national security strategy, or the rise of the national security state, the innovation-driven development strategy, where innovation is front and center, military strengthening in the neo era, that's sort of the Xi Jinping's phrase for military modernization of the People's Liberation Army and the broader defense establishment, and the notion of military civil fusion and the development strategy that accompanies it. And lastly, and I'll talk about this towards the end, the notion of economic securitization. And I'll go briefly on sort of like on many of these points itself. And you can sort of like see, and I do it in my book, I mean, each of these areas, there are clear sort of plans and strategies and guidances, sort of from sort of the 5-year plans, from the 13th to the 14th 5-year plans, sort of to sort of industrial policies made in China 2025, or long-term science and technology development plans itself, as well as on sort of the military strategies and guidances itself. And so it's so there's the guidances, but there's the implementation of the techno-security sort of state, which is incorporated in a lot of these sort of short, medium, and long-term sort of plans. So the first issue is, the rise of a increasingly sort of concerned and threat-orientated national security state. I mean, when Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, it's he takes over what sort of like at that time, and sort of like when you look at sort of like the leadership speeches, the defense white papers in the early 2010s, it's like China is in a relatively benign threat environment. If sort of like sort of the 2013 defense white paper, for example, like said, yes, there are growing challenges and there's concerns in the international system itself, sort of tensions sort of on the great power side, etc. But by and large, China is like from a very sort of like from an international relations neo-realist point of view, looking at the balance of the international system, the balance of power, China is not really seriously threatened. Sort of economic development remains the core priority itself. But Xi Jinping, when he comes to power, sort of like he sees this, but then he doesn't come from a conventional sort of like IR or neo-realist perspective. He's a provincial party secretary. He spent much of his time in in the party system. So he comes and he says, well, I'm going to look at national security very differently. Sort of like his assumptions, and we see this increasingly sort of made obvious, is that he says national security should be seen in political terms, in ideological terms itself, which means that it's not just about sort of like a neo-realist balance of power perspectives, looking sort of like at the external environment. It's about sort of like what are the sources of threats, the sources of concerns to the Chinese system, and in particular, it's the Chinese Communist Party that is sort of under threat. And it's like it's noteworthy that when he comes to power, it's like in his first few months, he sort of makes a major point about sort of like we should look at the historical narrative that China faces, and particularly he refers to the downfall of the Soviet Union, and that China didn't take the lessons correctly, because it was the issue of sort of political sort of threats, so like the political rot that undermined and eventually sort of led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And from there, you have sort of color revolutions, Arab Springs, and all those sort of like political sort of upheavals that leads to the dissolution of the parties in power. And to him, that's where the real national security threats come about. And so when you look at this he also sees that there's the neo-realists, the IR perspectives are also important, but it's this political perspective that is dominant. And he talks about this in his national security outlook that he calls this holistic security outlook that he emphasizes at the beginning of his term. And he's sort of like, and one of the arguments he makes is that China faces the most complicated external and internal threats in its history. And sort of like, and that's a major statement, because when you compare sort of like in the Communist Party's sort of history in power since 1949, it faced even bigger threats, sort of like in the 50s and 60s, the existential threat against the Soviet Union, against the US. But Xi Jinping doesn't say that China faces the biggest threats. He says China faces the most complicated internal and external factors. And so this means it's about the complicated nature of political threats, etc. And so what he does is like he builds a very sort of like repressive security state. He emphasizes the importance of ideological purification as well as anti-corruption. And he emphasizes time and time again, and even he says this in the 20th Party Congress, that China, even though it's enjoying sort of a very peaceful environment, you have to prepare for danger in times of peace and prepare for sudden incidents, so like these black swan or gray rhino events, etc. So what it means is that the national security perspective, the national security state, is much more sort of, it's seen to be in a more ominous and a more menacing sort of international and domestic environment. And a lot of these threats are internal, non-traditional, political, and emerging. So in terms of the techno-security state, the security side is that China is in a much more sort of like sort of worrisome, sort of threatened environment. And this is just the first term. It gets even worse in the second term, and also even more as we begin the third term. On the issue of military strengthening in the neo era, as I said, this is sort of like Xi Jinping's sort of key approach to thinking about sort of like military and defense modernization. And so sort of when Xi Jinping comes to power, one of the most important parts of his rule that he invests a lot of time, which is very, very important, because as a chairman of everything, the most important issue for Xi Jinping is what he can concentrate on and how much time. And sort of like becoming commander-in-chief, or formally the chairman of the Central Military Commission, Xi Jinping devotes an enormous amount of time in his first couple of terms compared to his predecessors on visiting military facilities, taking part in military meetings to define sort of like so the military's path of development, etc. And sort of like and when Xi Jinping goes and visits military bases and he gives military speeches, one of the things that he sort of points out over and over again is that the People's Liberation Army is very big, but it's not very strong itself. So this focus has to shift from quantity to quality. And for Xi Jinping, the focus on quality is at the essence is about innovation. And it's innovation very broadly defined in technological terms, but also in terms of organization, in terms of doctrine and strategy, innovation also in terms of human power, sort of like human talent and sort of like, and these soft power aspects of military power. And so what we see sort of is a major effort to revamp the military. And Xi Jinping also gives a clear timeline. It's like at the 19th Party Congress, in his keynote speech 5 years ago, he says that defense modernization would be sort of basically completed by 2035. That the PLA will become a comprehensive world-class military power by the mid-century. Although he doesn't say it, it's like this is sort of seen as a code word that China will begin to contest and challenge the US to become the dominant global military power by mid-century. I mean, these are sort of like very ambitious goals, but it's like, but I mean, they're realistic for Xi Jinping, especially the 2035 timeline itself. And then a third part of this techno-security state is the notion of military-civil fusion itself. So this is a term that is sort of like been pointed out quite a bit, especially by Washington, D.C., in its sort of like definition of why China is such a sort of like a top-class security threat to the U.S. And military-civil fusion is something that Xi Jinping sort of like points out, especially sort of from 2015 onwards, that military-civil fusion is a top priority for China's sort of economic and military development. It's a term that it doesn't originate from Xi Jinping. It actually comes from Hu Jintao, but Xi Jinping elevates it to sort of like from sort of a middle-ranking priority under Hu Jintao to a top-ranking priority from 2015 onwards. And the goal is to create a sort of this an integrated, interlocking sort of system that links sort of civilian economic development with military economic development, especially in the technological and industrial domains, that will be helping to sort of power China to become this global challenger to the US. So going back to the original of sort of China as an integrated techno-security state that is very different from the Soviet Union or Japan, this is an important part. But the problem for Xi Jinping, and this is sort of a problem sort of that is part of the nature of the Chinese systems, that Xi Jinping wants to have military civil fusion of sort of like this integrated sort of like sort of system between sort of this sort of like smoothly integrated between the civilian and the defense realms. But China, especially from an economic and from an institutional perspective, is a very sort of fragmented state, especially in sort of the industrial and economic domains. The civilian and the military systems have for very, very long, sort of like from the very beginning of the People's Republic in the end of the 1940s right to the present, they really haven't had much integration. So there's a lot of vertical integration and there's not much horizontal integration. So while Xi Jinping wants military civil fusion, the reality is that the Chinese system has sort of a lot of obstacles. And so the first sort of like, so Xi Jinping only gets serious about military civil fusion sort of in the second term of his reign. And a lot of that is what he calls, they have to prepare the groundwork, prepare the foundations, have a governance system, sort of set it up, sort of a bureaucracy that advocates for military service and all these parts, etc. And only sort of like this decade are they going to get serious in terms of implementation. So they've set the foundations, they've set the framework. They haven't really done very much yet to achieve military civil fusion. So military civil fusion is still sort of like has a lot of work to do, and how this progresses will also have a major impact on the success and failure of the Chinese Techno-Security State going forwards. So, and a very, very important part of so what I've laid out is a lot of the strategies and plans. But it's like one of the questions as I was writing this book was, when you look at the actual track record for China's sort of model for strategic and defense innovation, things like their space programs or hypersonics or aircraft carriers or some of these sort of like high-end, very big engineering or very big science programs in the defense and science science and technology areas, they've actually had a very good track record itself. It began back in the 1950s and 60s with their nuclear and strategic sort of like missile programs, what the Chinese call the Liandang Yixing, the 2 bombs and 1 satellite program, up until today. And so there's a particular motto for China's advance in its strategic and defense innovation. And I call this, there's a chapter in my book that talks about what I call the selective authoritarian mobilization and innovation motto that allows this very clunky, this top-down state-led system to be very sort of agile and effective on a very small number of the most important sort of strategic and defense programs itself. And so the reason why I call it is selective authoritarian mobilization and innovation is that it's selective, so it's only a small number of programs. You see sort of like in their 5-year plans or their long-term science and technology development plans, they have like a handful of mega projects, 16 back in the 2006 and 2020 medium and long-term science and technology development plan, 16 to 17 in more recent plans, etc. So they can only do a few, they can't do everything. It's authoritarian. The nature of the Chinese political system allows sort of like a top-down approach, and it's authoritarian, and it comes from the very top. Xi Jinping is in many ways the chief implementer of this model. But it's like the political and military leaderships are very engaged, and then it's about mobilization. Once you've selected, and it's sort of like and it's sort of embraced by the very top leadership, they can throw resources, whether it's efficient. A lot of it is there's a lot of waste, etc. But it's very, very effective itself. The question though is what kind of innovation model itself. And I would say there's what I call a SAMI A and a SAMI B model. So a lot of China's sort of like techno-security innovation, as well as broader sort of science and technology innovation, right up until the present day, is based upon what I call a re-innovation model. What the Chinese call this, like the Chinese term is Zai Chuangxing, is that it's about absorption of foreign technology and know-how from elsewhere around the world and using that to reverse engineer and to improve upon that and to make that sort of Chinese. And we've seen this in a whole range of areas, especially on the defense side, where it's like, for example, the Chinese have been able to sort of like absorb or import, for example, Russian military capabilities, fighter aircraft, warships, and then re-innovate, turn them into sort of Chinese types. I mean, on the civilian side of the sort of the most representative example is our high-speed trains, where the Chinese sort of rail industry, sort of at the beginning of the 2000s, were able to bring in sort of like examples of high-speed trains from Japan, from France, from Canada, sort of from Germany, etc., and they re-innovated them into Chinese trains. So this re-innovation model has been sort of this sort of what we also call a catch-up or a fast follower model. has been very, very successful. This has been sort of like at the center of China's industrial economic development in terms of innovation. And they've been doing that, and this sort of like has been sort of the central dynamo of China's innovation. But for Xi Jinping, I mean, this model remains very, very important to go through. But the problem for this model is that it won't make you the sort of like the champion if you're trying to compete and dominate against the US. So in the last few years, and this is sort of also emphasized in sort of like in these new plans, like the 14 5-year plan or the 2021-2035 medium long-term science and technology development plan. So Xi Jinping says we've got to pivot to an original discovery-based sort of like innovation model itself, where a lot of it is going to be indigenous, a lot of it's going to be homegrown. So there's a growing focus where the reinnovation model is very much of an engineering-based sort of like technology catch-up model. The original innovation model is very much focused on basic research that's done in China that then sort of moves up the research and development apparatus. So sort of like the original innovation model is about big R as about and big D, as opposed in the reinnovation model where it was small R and big D itself. And so we've seen this, that is like there's this major shift or the beginnings of a major shift from the SAMI A to the SAMI B itself. And Xi Jinping talks about it sort of a few weeks before the 20th Party Congress, sort of like in a sort of a meeting on comprehensive reform of the economy. So he talks about sort of like new approaches to come up with the SAMI B model. So this new whole of nation, sort of the Xingxi 中国体制 approach about how you sort of reorganize and identify sort of the key players sort of in a winning team for national innovation. This is something that sort of like is going to be a very, very important approach to thinking about going forwards in doing this. And we see this sort of like in the space sector and growing in sort of a number of other areas itself. So this is part of this effort at sort of like what is in store, sort of doing sort of like the sort of Xi Jinping's third term and fourth term going forwards itself. So, I mean, so becoming this sort of like this high-end sort of breakthrough sort of innovation model is a key part for Xi Jinping's efforts for the techno-security state itself. So sort of moving forwards in doing this itself is like, and he talks about this in the 20th Party Congress about building new institutions like national laboratories, so like or innovation centers to power this effort at focusing on breakthrough innovation, especially in emerging areas, whether it's on AI or it's sort of artificial intelligence or in quantum technologies or in high performance computing, and all these sort of like areas that they have to compete with if they're going to be able to power sort of like against the US. And so a quick sort of like dive into sort of like into the 20th Party Congress and what it means for this ongoing building of the Chinese techno-security state. I mean, when you look at sort of like Xi Jinping's sort of like keynote speech, sort of like at the beginning of the Congress, sort of like he very much sort of like sees himself sort of like as sort of like as this great helmsman sort of driving China to this promised land itself. And he talks about sort of like that his grand vision is, for this voyage is that it's going to be sort of it's going to be a lot of dangerous storms, a lot of sort of like choppy waters, but he's building an ever greater and more powerful ship to steer China to sort of like this promised land of sort of being one of the dominant players itself. And he talks about sort of how the strategic environment in globally is increasingly challenging, but there's also opportunities itself. He talks about sort of like we haven't seen changes sort of for the past century that has taken place, sort of in terms of a new round of science and technology revolution and industrial transformation, both in the civilian and the military spaces. There's this significant shift in the global power of balance that provides China with these new strategic opportunities. So that's the opportunity side, that there's sort of like all this upheaval, but China's well positioned technologically and militarily and strategically to take advantage. But there's enormous challenges that China faces, whether it's the pandemic, sort of like the anti-globalization trends that are taking place, a lot of these regional conflicts, in particular, of course, Russia, Ukraine, as well as sort of deep-seated domestic problems, and in particular, and of course, sort of like sort of with coded reference to what the US is doing in terms of clamping down on export controls and technology exports to China. He talks about all these external attempts to suppress and contain China that is escalating at any time, etc. So Xi Jinping sort of concludes by this is that so there's these strategic opportunities, these risks and challenges that are concurrent at the same time, and so China needs to be prepared to sort of deal with these black swan or gray rhino events. And he talks about, and this is sort of references to the words that he uses in the 20th Party Congress. But he also provides sort of like, so what can we expect in the third term? And he talks about sort of his policy agenda for the next 5 years. One is to make this major progress in creating a new development pattern and building a more modern economy. Sort of with sort of this means that a lot of sort of like these economic changes, especially to focus on sort of this innovation-driven development strategy, is going to be increasing. The emphasis on self-reliance in science and technology, and much more so than his previous keynote speeches at the 18th or 19th Party Congresses. There's the importance of consolidation national security. And especially, he mentions about the importance of safeguarding economic security and also the fulfillment of sort of like the goals for the 100th anniversary of the People's Liberation Army in 2027. So at the 20th Party Congress, he advances some of the timelines. As I mentioned, in the 19th Party Congress, the focus was on 2035 as sort of like the immediate priority for China's defense modernization. He actually moves this forward in some areas to 2027, but he doesn't really, and the Chinese authorities, they don't really sort of go about and saying, what are these goals for the centenary? They keep it vague. And also in his 20th Party Congress speech, he talks about sort of the top targets for 2035. So there's the 5 years to 2027, but there's this longer term target, which much of it is incorporated in his sort of like in the 2021 to 2035 medium and long term science and technology development plan, about the importance of significantly enhancing economic strength and overall national strength. So national strength is including the economic, but the technological, the military, and the diplomatic, and the geopolitical. Becoming one of the world's most innovative powers. So this emphasis of like on moving from an absorption-based model to an original innovation model. Comprehensively strengthening the national security system and capabilities, and achieving the defense modernization. So this is about building up all aspects of the techno-security base, both the domestic security as well as the external security, and to lead the world in overall national strength and international influence by the mid-century. So this is increasingly explicit. And a part of this, as I said, it's like the emphasis on economic security. So while sort of in this first two terms of the building up of the techno-security state, a lot of it was about military civil fusion, a lot of it was about military strengthening, about national security. I see that sort of like in the third term, economic securitization is going to become increasingly important itself, that it's especially sort of like from 2018, 2019, as China increasingly experiences sort of like economic sanctions, technology controls from the US and also from Europe and other Western allies, that it's that they see that the Chinese economy, broadly speaking, is becoming increasingly threatened from an economic security point of view. And so, although they have talked about the importance of economic security for many years, a lot of it was focused originally on microeconomic perspective, but I think increasingly it's on the macro foundations of economic securitization, supply chains, technological self-reliance, preventing external shocks, etc. So what we're seeing is this broadening sort of the techno-security state into sort of like a more mainstream sort of like national economic sectors itself. And so they've been talking about sort of the dual circulation strategy, about sort of increasing domestic economic resilience. And this is going to be sort of a more and more an important theme as we go into the third term, etc. I'm going to end it here. So I have a whole section on sort of the US-China sort of strategic competition, but it's like, but I'm sure this will sort of stretch into for the next 2 hours. But it's like, so I'll end it here, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Tai, for that excellent presentation. I know the book is so well researched and has a lot of rich analysis that are based on your research. A lot of it is from firsthand Chinese language documentation as well. So thanks so much for providing us with the highlights of your book. And I highly recommend to our audience members to read the book. There's so much content in there. As you mentioned the point of the US-China competition, and in your book, I recall you made a really interesting attempt to estimate the size, economic size of the Chinese and the US techno-security state, you know, as compared to the GDP of the two countries. Perhaps that number could be a little surprising to some people, as you know, maybe people are thinking it's bigger than it is, or maybe smaller than it is, and perhaps you could share with us some of your thinking and the potential policy implications of that estimate.
Great. I mean, thanks for that sort of like a great question. Yeah. So as I was writing this book, sort of halfway through, sort of like I was in this presentation, someone sort of asked me the sort of like what is an obvious question, but it's like it didn't really occur to me. So how big is the techno-security state? And I said, I mean, that's a really great question. And it's like, and it's really sort of like it all depends on how you sort of like measure it itself. So it's, I mean, so I go in the book and I sort of do a little bit. It's more of a back of the envelope assessment rather than sort of taking a lot of time, which will require another book to do that. But my estimate is like, I mean, based upon sort of looking at sort of key components of the US and Chinese techno-security states, sort of like in the same vein, like the defense industrial apparatus, sort of the dual use sector, the strategic sectors that have sort of important sort of military and security uses, the domestic law enforcement apparatus and all that. If you put all those elements together, the US techno-security state, I estimate to be about sort of like 7 or 8%, and the Chinese techno-security is about 6 to 7%. Whether it's like a particular figure, I mean, it's like it's under 10% for both countries. And to me, this is a relatively sort of like I mean, not minor, but not overwhelming size itself. So it's like so there's like more than 90% of both the Chinese and the US economies that are not really engaged on sort of high-end technology or security activities that has sort of security implications. So my argument is that as long as you sort of like both on the Chinese side or the US side, they ring fence and make very, very sort of clear to separate sort of the techno-security portions of the state with the non-techno-security portions. There's a vast amount of the two economies that can cooperate and sort of that can do trade. And I think you need that nuance, because it's like, I mean, a lot of the arguments that we see sort of politically, sort of in the US or elsewhere, is that the Chinese Techno-Security State is everywhere. It seeps into all parts of the Chinese system, which is not a very useful argument itself, because as we see, it's like, I mean, a lot of US firms, whether it's sort of technology firms, for example, the sort of semiconductor firms, they depend on trade with China for a lot of their sort of like profits and creativity. A lot of that goes back into research and development. And so if you cut yourself off completely with China, this is going to have a significant impact on sort of the economic competitiveness and innovation competitiveness of foreign countries, etc. So I think it's important to find a way to, while mitigating and preventing sort of like security leakages from the techno-security state, there's a lot more that the US and China and the world can benefit from engaging itself, as long as it doesn't impact on their security. But the problem, of course, is that national security or military security or technological security keeps getting redefined. It's becoming more and more broader itself, so the goalposts keep moving. But it is like, but it is incumbent on people like us to sort of provide sort of more nuanced, more detailed analysis for policymakers.
Well, thank you for that. I think here's a question that is probably related to this topic we're just touching upon. Here's a question from an audience member. Could you talk a bit about the entity list the U.S. government provides and the Chinese response, and how does such a list affect the security issues of both countries and the U.S.-China relations as a whole?
Mm. I mean, sort of like the entity list, and there's several different parts of these entity lists from different parts of the US system. There's the Defense Department, they have entity lists, the Commerce Department, etc. And so there's sort of like the entity list has become increasingly in vogue on the US side, especially since the Trump administration, since sort of the mid to late 2010s. And these entity lists are intended to identify sort of Chinese firms and also Hong Kong firms that are engaged in activities that is like that is detrimental to U.S. national security, etc. So they put there, it means they are banned from sort of engaging in trade or investment with with the U.S. and with the West. I mean, it's interesting when you look at sort of before the mid 2010s. These entity lists have been sort of in place since the Cold War, and the Chinese and Hong Kong firms didn't really feature up until sort of the mid 2010s. But since then, it's been growing very, very rapidly. And so these lists are a key part of the export control regime that the US has had. But it's like, but it is important to note that these entity lists are very, very specific, and they've been sort of the weapon of choice on the US to sort of part of this sort of like decoupling or sort of all export controls with the US. But in the last couple of weeks, sort of like both in terms of the US national security strategy and with sort of this new approach, or what sort of people call the Sullivan technology doctrine, in reference to Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, is that the U.S. is stepping up sort of like its export controls and its efforts to stop China from getting advantage of U.S. technological and knowledge capabilities. That it's not just about lists; it's about sort of like identifying whole technology areas. In this case, in the last week, it's on semiconductors and preventing sort of Chinese firms, whether on the entity list or they're not on the entity list, to get access to a lot of these sort of like semiconductor technologies. And so what we're seeing is a major shift in terms of technology areas that the Chinese are going to be barred with. So first is semiconductors, and we can probably expect that other technological sort of like areas will sort of be included going forward. So we're moving sort of to the next level up, which will be as we've seen, even more devastation to the Chinese economy than just the entities lists.
Thank you for that answer. And another question from our audience member. There's some top Canadian expert estimate 70% of US innovation arise from public investment funded for US military to use technology needs. And then there's another layout by the author in the 2007 book. So this audience member wonder, what would you estimate as the scale of the Chinese public-private integrated impact on the Chinese innovation capacity? It's probably a tough question to answer in terms of the exact percentage, but do you happen to have a sense of, what would that percentage be in the range of?
So I mean, a lot of these figures are banded around. Yeah, so it's like, so I see in the chat, it's like, I mean, it's a reference to Linda White's book, which is a great book, which I reference quite a bit in my own book itself. I mean, it's for the US, a lot of sort of like the technologies, the innovation that the rest of the economy has gotten from the military is a lot of it was being derived during the Cold War. I mean, during the Cold War, the US defense R&D budget accounted for about sort of 30% of overall research and development during the Cold War. This was in the 60s and in the 70s. To today, the US defense R&D budget as a proportion of overall global R&D is around sort of 2 to 3%. So it's come down by sort of like sort of many sort of factors down. And so today, in the 21st century, the US sort of like defense sector actually contributes sort of less to both US and global R&D sort of like than the surveillance sectors, etc. Some colleagues of mine have been looking sort of like how much sort of like defense R&D is coming out by sort of the big US defense firms like Boeing or Lockheed Martin, and they say the big US defense sort of corporate companies spend a lot less on R&D today than Google or Facebook or Apple. So there's been a major shift that it's like today the center of gravity for innovation, both in the US and globally, is far less, so that it's overwhelmingly from the commercial side rather than the military side. And for China, I mean, it's like the Chinese defense R&D system, they've been very compartmentalized itself, and they spent relatively small amounts. We don't know because the Chinese are never given any figures itself, but I think it's a lot of the sort of like sort of Chinese defense R&D hasn't really filtered across into the civilian side. Some of it did back sort of like in the 1980s, when sort of like when Deng Xiaoping came to power, there was this effort to demilitarize the Chinese economy and focus on, at that period, what they call defense conversion, Jundramming at that time. And so there was a lot of sort of like conversion of military capabilities for civilian goods, etc. And there are statistics where it's like like at the height of this defense conversion process, sort of back in the 1990s, sort of between 80 to 90% of the defense industry was focused on making commercial goods, on sort of like on automobiles, or so like or white goods, etc. And sort of that sort of defense conversion rate has today is around 40 to 50%. So the Chinese defense firms to today, about sort of 50% of what they produce is still for commercial goods, and 50% is for military goods. So that might be sort of a proxy figure to understand about sort of like the relationship between sort of like sort of the military and the civilian sort of industrial outputs.
Right. So again, a question from the audience member. So how do you think it does affect the US-China research collaboration in broad areas like AI, biotech, and so on and so forth?
I mean, it's I mean, we've seen in the last few years, it's had a very, very sort of like major impact on reducing our sort of like collaboration. We've seen sort of a number of bottom-up studies. There have been studies, especially looking at sort of like how sort of like scientists in the US with Chinese ethnicity are given up, or some of them are going back to China, or some of them are doing their own research but having nothing to do sort of like with collaboration with Chinese colleagues. We saw with the FBI, with the China initiative, sort of like cracking down on sort of like on scientists with collaborations with the US. And also we've seen that on the Chinese side, although on the Chinese side, they're more willing to sort of like to maintain collaborations, because the Chinese have more to lose by cutting off this R&D collaboration. But I think it's like today and going forwards over the next decade, I mean, it's like if we see what is going on both on the US and the China side in the political climate, it's like there's going to be more and more sort of like reductions, like clampdowns on research and development collaboration, because this great power competition sort of is going to only increase. So the collaborations we see are going to significantly decline. So the trend lines are clear, and I really sort of like are not positive that there will be any significant adjustments to this sort of sharp decline going forwards between US and China science and technology collaborations.
Indeed, I think that's sort of a feeling that is shared among many people in the Canada-China or US-China field of studies. So here's a question. Of course, where most of our audience members are from Canada. So here's a question about Canada and as how tied we are in Canada with the US, and how might this situation, the competition, tense competition between the Chinese and the US Techno-Security State, how would it affect Canada, and how might we see this play out in our economy, and like what, and maybe the implication for the Taiwan issue in the Canada-US-China relationship?
I mean, that's another great question. I mean, it's the US has made it clear that it's like it's taken the lead, and it's taken a very tough line, and it wants its allies to sort of like to be very closely aligned with what it's doing in terms of this decoupling and this sort of great power competition. I mean, it's like whether it's Canada or it's Australia or it's Japan or it's the sort of like the UK and other Europeans. So each country sort of like have their own national interest that often doesn't sort of come closely aligned with the US. But it has become increasingly clear that, especially sort of like on the technological side, that it's like that there is coming together, that China is increasingly sort of like an area of concern. So we see on the Chips 4 alliance that the US is pushing on that, on these sort of like other sort of technological trade areas, that is like whether sort of like sort of like between Canada and the US, etc., that has come in together sort of. But I think it's like on the well, there's a lot of shared interests on the technological and there's less sharing of interests on the economic and the military side, etc. I think it's like sort of other countries are sort of like sort of more hesitant to stand up to China sort of in the military sphere. So the US is very much sort of emphasizing the importance, especially because of Taiwan and the lessons from the Ukraine, that it really needs to step up to support Taiwan. We see a more sort of like reluctance. So especially sort of like countries that are that may be affected by that. So sort of like so it depends on different strands. On the technological strand, the US is sort of very much sort of like sort of being supported by its other allies. On the economic, broader economic and some of the military side, there's sort of a little bit more light between the US and sort of Canada and the other allied countries.
Thank you for that. And perhaps just as a last question, again, I highly recommend our audience members to read the book. And you spent a lot of volume and great analysis to talk about this competition the US and the Chinese techno-security states are having, and it's clearly intensifying. But do you see one of these two states, currently the US, still in the lead? Do you see China's catching up soon, potentially even overtaking the US in sort of the mid to long term future? And do you see the two countries can still perhaps avoid a major conflicts down the road?
Right. I mean, so there's a few questions there itself. I mean, first of all, I mean, I see a lot of this the techno-security competition, as we saw with the Cold War between the Soviet Union and with Japan, etc. A lot of this is taking place in the peacetime domain. So a lot of this is like, while there's a focus on military modernization, sort of military arms races, etc. This doesn't necessarily mean that the US and China are going to go to war. I mean, that's sort of like that's more specific to what's going on in the Taiwan Strait or some of these other areas. So the US and China can compete increasingly in adversarial and intense terms on sort of like on military technology and strategic technology, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to go to war. And I think the chances of war are quite limited itself. But the problem is the two sides are not really talking to each other itself. And then the question is who's going to win over the near, medium, and long term, I think. I mean, so in the book, I mean, I look at sort of a framework and a number of key characteristics, like 5 or 6 key characteristics. And by and large, the US is strong in many of these areas itself, in terms of the governance regime, in terms of the nature of sort of a techno-secure and techno-nationalist model of how it engages with the rest of the world, etc. I mean, the Chinese, while they have a lot of the momentum and they have the top level political support, when you look at the structural features of the Chinese techno-security state, etc., there's a lot of problems. And perhaps sort of the most important is the relationship between the state and market. So the Chinese status model tends to be fairly brittle. And it's like, and there's a lot of sort of legacy and sort of like and baggage problems with the Chinese system. And especially in the last couple of years, we saw this lurch leftwards by Xi Jinping, the crackdown on sort of like on the private technology giants, of like the move to sort of common prosperity, etc. It's like there's a question mark, sort of like that Xi's like moving away from sort of like a more balanced sort of state-market relationship to much more of a heavy-handed state relationship. And we know that sort of like innovation, not just with China, but in broader terms, innovation doesn't really like sort of a heavy state interventionist role. That often may help at the beginning stages, but it's not helpful for long-term sort of innovation sustainability. Sort of like innovation does better in a more market and more competitive environment. So the US anti-status motto is still strong, although a lot of it is aging, so it needs to be revamped, and we're beginning to see this. As long as the US sort of updates and modernizes its techno-security motto, then I think it has a much better chance of staying ahead itself. While the Chinese motto, even though it's got the political momentum, it's got sort of like the resource momentum, there are a lot of barriers that sort of like that I think makes it difficult for it to be able to sort of overtake the US in overall terms. It may, in pockets, in sort of in AI or a few areas, it may sort of like get in the lead, but overall, sort of like I think the US remains in the driving seat.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Tai, for this excellent and truly fascinating discussion. And again, I highly recommend to our audience member to read the book. There's so much content in there and so much insights. So thank you again for being with us today and to share with us your insights of this book and this very important topic. And I also like to thank colleagues at the Chinese Institute for organizing this seminar. And finally, a big thanks to all the audience members for attending our event today. Do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.